Hello, friends, and welcome to the March 2nd edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we have an exciting episode for you today as we welcome Shelly Skeen to the program. Shelly is a senior attorney with Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving the full recognition of civil rights of the LGBT community and those living with HIV. So obviously, in light of the Attorney General and Governor making news with horrific attacks on trans youth last week, she's been busy and will talk to us about those non-binding opinions, what we should know, and how we can respond. We'll also be joined by Texas Impact board member and executive director of the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry, Reverend Erin Walter, to reflect on Shelly's comments and how Texans of faith can respond. This week on Josh's weekly watch list, Josh talks about the attacks on trans youth and what he's watching in response to the invasion of Ukraine. And to kick us off, we'll begin with a weekly word from Cantor Sheri Allen of Fort Worth, who shares her reflection as the parent of a transgender child. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks as always to all who've reached out in response to our recent episodes. We love to get your comments, questions, and suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. I'll be looking for your emails at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. And y'all, I don't even know where to start this week. I'm recording this on Election Day in Texas, a day when I'd usually be having conversations with friends and neighbors about the primaries or preparing to watch President Biden's first State of the Union address with my kids. But instead, like all of you, I am in a state of shock and grief. The news coming from Ukraine is frightening, and Ukraine leaders and communities are showing such bravery and resilience. My guess is that we're all struggling with how to respond without just sitting back, watching the scenes and weeping. At the same time, I'm livid at the horrific, cynical political plays by the Texas Attorney General and Governor, who are trying to score political points by threatening to take transgender youth away from their parents. None of this is okay. And as Texans of faith and conscience, we should all be outraged. And maybe this is just my therapy outlet for the week, and maybe I'm just trying to pick myself up off the mat. But I've been talking to friends, and I feel like many of us are just too rattled to do much but sit down and watch and mourn. And I think the challenge for Texans of faith is to use these policy failures at multiple levels to remind us that more than ever, our voice is vital in the policy process. It's not time to mourn. It's time to organize. Runoff elections are coming and a general election in November with plenty of opportunities to talk to our elected representatives between now and then. So, y'all, I don't have all the answers, but I appreciate you turning in so we can think through our next steps together. So with that, here we go. The Weekly Word with Cantor Sheri Allen.
When our son Preston came out as transgender 5 years ago, at the age of 24, my husband Richard and I were a bit surprised and had lots of questions. And we talked through all our concerns to gain a better perspective of what Preston was going through and how we could best support him. He was living in New York at the time, and after years of struggle, he was finally able to let go of the fear, doubt, and insecurity that had plagued him for years. He hid it well, and we had no idea how unhappy he had been. And we were grateful and relieved that he trusted us enough to know that he could confide in us, and we would support and affirm his decision. He cut off his long red hair, which he often used to hide his face, started shopping in the men's department, and began taking testosterone. And we celebrated all the subtle yet significant physical and emotional changes that accompany the hormone shots. When the time finally came for surgery, he was more than ready to shed the tight cloth binders he had been wrapping his chest in and which had caused him debilitating back pain. He was literally and figuratively released. a new man, free to live his best life authentically and unapologetically. My husband and I love our son unconditionally, and we were there for him every step of the way. We helped him find the Chicago doctor that would perform his surgery because New York had too long of a waiting list. My husband fought to ensure that this gender-affirming procedure would be covered on our insurance. We flew down to be with him until he was ready to go back to New York, spending those cold December days binge-watching the Great British Baking Show and changing his bandages. So it's incomprehensible to me, as a parent and clergy, that today, in the state that has been our home for almost 30 years, the state in which we raised all three of our extraordinary LGBTQ children, that Governor Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton would have parents like us prosecuted as criminals. Last week, Paxton shared his unfounded and grossly inaccurate opinion that administering gender-affirming care to trans youth amounts to child abuse, leading Governor Abbott to instruct the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate parents who are seeking out such treatments. And although this directive is not legally binding, it has already caused heightened panic and fear in the homes of families throughout Texas, some of whom are even thinking about leaving the state for their own safety. I can't imagine what other trans youth and their parents are going through right now. Offering medically necessary, potentially life-saving treatment to trans youth is not child abuse, and there is no court in Texas or anywhere else that has ever ruled otherwise. Attempting to remove children from loving homes, which will only lead to heightened emotional distress, fear, self-doubt, and trauma, that's child abuse, and it's being sanctioned by the state of Texas. It is our responsibility as faith leaders and human beings to lift up our voices in protest and to demand that our leaders stop using these children and families for their own political gain. It is up to us to affirm that every trans child, as well as every human being, is made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that each reflects that spark of divinity. We can open our doors and welcome all those who seek a safe place to worship and provide compassionate, spiritual care and support. We can offer affirmation and emotional protection. And we can show up in numbers when the legislature is back in session to make sure that bills are passed that will protect trans youth and those who love them from further harm. We must not stand idly by.
This week's episode of Weekly Witness was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for the conversation today is Shelly Skeen, a senior attorney with Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving the full recognition of civil rights of the LGBT community and those living with HIV. Shelly, thanks for joining us. And what I know is an extremely busy week for you and your colleagues. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, grateful to be here. Thank you.
So, hopefully I got that introduction correct, but why don't you tell us, for those who aren't familiar, about Lambda Legal and your work?
Right, sure. So what Lambda Legal does is, like you said before, we're the oldest and largest national organization that works for full and lived equality for LGBTQ plus people and people who are living with HIV. And we do that through impact litigation, policy work, and education. And so that sounds like a lot, and it is. We worked on cases from everything from Lawrence versus Texas to Obergefell, the marriage equality decision, and we've been in the background on all of the major moves forward with respect to LGBTQ rights and for those people who are living with HIV.
So we've talked about issues related to the LGBT community, particularly over the course of the last 2 or more years, our transgender neighbors. And one of the things we've talked about, and we've had guests talk about time and time again, is the importance for Texans of faith in particular to speak up for equality. In part because some of our colleagues with different views who also claim a faith background are some of the ones who are driving a lot of these discriminatory pieces of legislation, so many of these discriminatory actions. And so one of the questions I think our listeners are interested in hearing about is why people like you choose to engage in this work. Like you've taken this up as a calling in your life, right? So why are you interested in spending your life doing this work?
Well, I think as part of, social justice is you're helping other people, and you're helping people who don't have a voice or can't lift up their voices, and helping them get the, equity, equality, and dignity and respect that each and every one of us deserves. I mean, I can't emphasize enough, this work to me feels like I'm of service, and that's my job, is not to put my ego in it, but really to do the work and be able to recognize the human beings in front of me and help them live the best possible lives that they can.
Absolutely. We certainly appreciate you doing that important work. So jumping right in, right? So we've all seen the headlines by now, but can you talk to us some about the Attorney General Paxton's non-binding opinion relating to transgender children last week?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the first thing is it's not binding. It's not binding on anyone. And then the governor issued a letter after the opinion came out, and that's also not binding. And what I think it's done is it's taking one subset of our population and it's ostracizing and marginalizing that subset of our population. And it's also saying that the government has the opportunity to reach into our private lives, into the private decisions that we make with our families and with our doctors, and that it's overreach.
So for those who haven't dug significantly past the headlines, what exactly do these non-binding orders say?
Right. Well,
I wonder how many times can we say non-binding in this podcast? We should start counting. But
so Attorney General opinions are just that. They're an opinion about a hypothetical situation. There are not real live people involved. And so Matt Krause, who is running for the DA in Fort Worth, sent a letter to the Attorney General asking whether or not medically necessary best practice standards of care or gender affirming care for trans youth could be considered under the Texas Family Code child abuse. And the Attorney General says on the very second page of his opinion that this opinion does not apply to medically necessary care for young people. And so that's where we should stop reading, because the other 12 pages are really, I think, a lot of I think it's a lot of smoke and mirrors and it signals misinformation. It's full of, and it's not good for any person here in our state who's transgender or gender diverse or non-binary.
So obviously, as soon as the news started breaking, we started getting questions from listeners, from members, and I wonder if you could say a few words about what the medical community in particular says about gender affirming care.
Sure. So every major medical association, so whether it's the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the Pediatric Endocrine Society, every major medical association, then also social workers have said that ensuring that kids' lives, and so let me go back and say that for young people who identify as transgender or gender diverse or non-binary, about 48 to 54% of them consider seriously taking their own lives. And so there are other studies that show that when they are affirmed in their gender, both at home, at school, and in all of their activities, that suicide rate dips dramatically. And so every major medical association, the American Medical Associations, sent a letter to the governors of every state in April of last year saying there are normal variations in gender identity, and ensuring that youth and young people get gender affirming care saves their lives. And I think if that is what, if there's anything that anyone gets out of this podcast, every major medical association, based on peer-reviewed science, says that this is best practice medical care and it saves lives. And so there can't be anything wrong with that. And that is what I think is the most important for people to know.
Speaking of saving lives, my social media feed is probably filled with more clergy than most people's, right? Because of the job and the role that I have. And so watching them grapple with this on social media this weekend was certainly something, because so many of those clergy were saying that they've been intentional about making sure that the transgender community in Texas knew that they were loved, that they were accepted, at least many of the clergy that I'm following. And so seeing this come out and suggestions from some that mandatory reporters needed to be turning in these children was horrifying to them. So I wonder if you can just kind of speak clearly to those clergy. They don't have a responsibility to turn people in, right?
Right. So the Attorney General's opinion is not binding on anyone. It is not law. It has not changed the law. There is a statute in place that the legislature passed that does say what the law is. And in that statute, it says that parents are required to provide their young people in their family with medically necessary care. And so the Attorney General's opinion didn't change the law. The law is still the same. There's no mandatory duty to report. And last year, the legislature actually made the standard higher that triggers the duty to report. It's a reasonable cause. It used to be just cause to believe. So not only is the standard higher, but what we're talking about is, meaning gender affirming care is medically necessary, is within what the law that's been passed, that's on the books, is what parents should be doing. So that's why the Attorney General's opinion should be wholly and completely disregarded.
Again, because it's what? Non-binding, friends. So serious question though, like how are parents feeling right now? Any idea? I mean, this has to be a stressful time. So are parents afraid right now? Are you aware? Are they expecting a lot of reports? Any insight that you might be able to share with listeners?
Yeah, I think parents are obviously, if you have, your young person in your house, your child, and someone from the outside of, some governmental entity is trying to reach into your home and tell you how to raise your child, or tell you what it is that your child needs. And your child is the most precious thing that you have, right? We all have a natural instinct to protect our kiddos. And with that, parents are completely, they're pretty worried about this. We had a podcast last week, and we announced it that day, and we had over 400 people sign up wanting information about what this means. And I, again, cannot emphasize enough what you're seeing on social media and what you're seeing about whether or not this is binding and there's any duty to report. It's simply false. And parents are worried for their families, and parents are, to the extent that they can, but this is not all parents, are not able to leave the state. But there are many parents who have already made plans or have left this state or are making plans to leave our state. And that's bad for Texas. It's bad for our economy, and it's bad for our ability to live with each other in a diverse environment.
So, will we know if reports have been made? Is there a way that we can monitor what's happening with state law enforcement?
I think the easiest thing is that we've seen multiple district attorneys in the bigger counties say that we are not going to look into these reports. And certainly simply because a kid is trans, that's not what the opinion addresses, even if the opinion, that's not what the opinion addresses. And so we've seen district attorneys in the bigger cities say, we're not going to look into this. There's not really a way, it's a confidential process to the extent that reports are made. And therefore we're not going to be able to know, how many reports were made or in what counties without doing an open records request.
So our listeners typically like homework assignments, and I wonder if you can maybe give us some advice about what listeners can do to protect Texas kids, and specifically, I guess, how local congregations can support trans kids and their families that either they know that it's in their congregation or maybe ones in their community that they don't know.
Right. I think what you can do is first and foremost recognize the young people in your congregations and affirm their identities. Right? Affirm who they are, affirm the precious gift of their humanity, treat them with equity, dignity, and respect, treat their families the same way. And then from there, reach out to your local legislator and tell them that the state of Texas needs to stop targeting one subset of our population. There are not that many transgender folks in Texas. As a whole, we're looking at maybe 0.6% of our population. And by targeting one group to the exclusion of every other group, you ostracize, marginalize, and otherize that particular group. And so what we're seeing in school districts is we're seeing trans young people being bullied, being harassed. And I think it's really important for people of faith to recognize that our job is to support and take care of and to do what we can to step up to the plate or to help people who don't have what we have, who aren't getting a fair shake.
And as you mentioned as part of that answer, and communicating that to our legislators in no uncertain terms. So anything else you'd like to leave us with today?
I think reach out. I think this is going to be a long process. It's going to be a long process of educating our neighbors. It's going to be a long process of educating our legislators. It's going to be a long process of affirming the people that we know. I mean, and that's what helps change our natural biases. And so please continue to reach out when you hear about this particular group of people being targeted for different treatment from everyone else, treatment that's unfair, that diminishes who they are as human beings, that you need to speak out and speak out loud. I would say, it's a letter from Birmingham jail. Are we going to be complicit by being quiet? Or are we going to make our voices heard? That's how we can stop this.
Amen. And anywhere we can go to find for more, or anywhere we can go to look for more information?
You can go to Lambda Legal's website, which is www.lambdalegal.org. And we have an FAQ, so frequently answered questions sheet that is there for parents, families, and anyone who wants to go take a look at it. We also have some blog posts that tell you a little bit more about what's going on, at least right now, but we keep our first front page abreast of all of the current happenings across the country and the attempts to, marginalize different subsets of people. And it's not just happening with trans youth, it's happening with books, and it's happening with respect to our just general rights and ability to show up and get housing, food, healthcare, and public accommodations, so seeking goods and services. We all need to be treated the same.
Well, Shelly, thank you for this incredible work, and thank you for taking a little bit of time today to share information about these actions with our listeners. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And now we're joined by Texas Impact Advocacy Director Josh Houston for the weekly watch list. And Josh, it seems like the entire world is watching one of two things. Clearly, everybody throughout the world is watching and praying for and hoping for the best outcome in Ukraine, but also for those who follow the Texas legislature, watching the actions of the governor and the attorney general last week. So obviously, this episode is focusing on the anti-trans, non-binding actions that state leaders have taken. But do you have a quick update on the attorney general opinion from your end?
Yeah, I do. I mean, since we recorded one of our guests, just in the last couple minutes, news has broken that the state is now actively investigating families that seek gender-affirming medical care. And now that someone has standing, we also now have a lawsuit. So we are watching a brand new active lawsuit on this.
And so we'll, I assume, keep people updated in the weeks and months to come on that.
Yes, that's of course.
And so, obviously the big news from throughout the world is the situation in Ukraine. So people keep asking us, how do we respond? And what are you watching there?
Yeah, so, I mean, with events in Europe, it is going to be very, very tough to focus on things happening here in Texas. But it is critical that we do. If you've heard us talk before, we've said, for years to pay less attention to Washington, D.C. and pay closer attention to state and local issues. And that's because that's where your voice, your vote, your contributions are most effective, close to home. That's discipline. It takes a lot of discipline, right, Scott? It's not indifference to what's happening overseas. Quite the contrary. This battle, the Ukrainian cause, the American cause for democracy and against autocracy requires that discipline. So don't take our word for it. Yesterday, I was on a national call with faith leaders from across the United States. The Office of Faith-Based Partnerships has been working with religious leaders on the ground in Ukraine, and they had a priest named Father Serhii, who's a Ukrainian priest and a military chaplain, and he's been ministering to the needs of people in eastern Ukraine, where war has been constant since 2014. And he was asked, that question you just asked me, Scott. Folks want to help. What do we need? What do you need? And he said three things, and it was really interesting things. I mean, one, prayer, obviously. Two, our moral voice telling the truth about the Ukrainian cause. And three, our advocacy with elected officials in the U.S. He did not want supplies. He did not want money. Those were the three things that he needed. Why? Well, as Ukrainians flee west, the current wait time at the border was 3 to 5 days as of yesterday, but will soon be weeks. The Russians are using indiscriminate bombing and thermobaric weapons like in Syria. Bottom line, what that means is there will be nowhere for people to return to regardless of the outcome. There will be numerous refugees. Refugees will come through the UN and through American resettlement agencies. But desperate people will also be showing up at our southern border. We can count on that. And based on current rhetoric, it will not go well when they do. You'll recall how our governor responded in 2015 when Syrians faced, or still facing, I assume, but faced a similar situation. Refugees are resettled in the U.S. through nonprofit resettlement agencies, many of which are your ministry, supported by your denominations. Governor Abbott ordered them to stop resettling Syrians or lose their state contract. That, of course, violated federal law, and the nonprofits prevailed in court. Thereafter, the state then just abolished its Office for Refugee Resettlement at the state level. Nothing has really changed since 2015. This summer, while we were all working on a special session, the state decided, governor ordered that we stop licensing the children's homes that house unaccompanied minors that try to cross our southern border. And the whole end of this primary campaign for governor has been focused on the southern border, where we have been prosecuting migrants in our state courts. So Father Sergei and millions of Ukrainians need you to pay attention to state and local issues. They need you paying attention to your local primary runoffs. It's election day today when we're recording, but by the time you hear this, we'll be in the primary runoff season. They need you engaged in the November general election. They need you to form relationships with your elected officials and to know about your refugee resettlement ministries. Doing your part to help Ukraine means doing your part as a citizen of a democracy here at home.
You did mention that today's election day. This will come out the day after election day. But anything that you're watching politically in terms of how all this is going to play out?
Yeah, it is super unclear at this time. So it's too soon to tell, but I do want to talk about what I'm watching. On the Republican side, there are at least two factions that are emerging. There are the traditional Republicans like Condoleezza Rice, who was on Fox News and talked about how Biden had united NATO in a way she did not imagine possible. She reflects the wing of the party that is more traditional. I think some people would say neoconservative, but I don't think we have to put a label on it. Then you have the other wing of the party that's the old American First, not the old American First, but the President Trump's wing that is the American First doctrine of isolationism, and to the point of being kind of pro-Russian and everywhere in between those two spectrums. On the Democratic side, you have three possible factions that are less defined. You always have a peace wing of the party that kind of opposes any sort of conflict. You have a overly cautious part of the party that proceeds extremely cautiously on matters. And then you have I'll call it a Charlie Wilson wing of the party. For those of you who may remember, Charlie Wilson was the East Texas congressman that really was instrumental among other people, but he was really instrumental in arming the Afghans against the Soviet invasion in the early 80s. So I think you have those three possibilities on the Democratic side, and we would hope for moral courage from our leadership, from any elected official. But if we're honest, most are windsocks at an airport. They are waiting to see which way the wind blows, and so we're only 6 days into this crisis. Many are waiting for polling. What that means is that the narrative is still being shaped. Will Americans make sacrifices, such as higher gas prices? Do we or are we able to withstand and counter the giant Russian disinformation machines that are out there and on social media? How do the tech giants respond? We don't know where this is going. It is certainly a massive uncertainty for those in elected positions, which is why Father Sergei said our moral voice as faith leaders is so imperative to the Ukrainian fight.
Well, Josh, your watch list this week is certainly sobering, but full of things that we'll all be watching over the course of the weeks and months to come. Keep an eye on the space for more information as we move forward on both issues. Josh, we'll see you next week.
All right, bye, Scott.
Joining us for our response today is Reverend Erin Walter, the minister and executive director of the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry and a Texas Impact board member. Erin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we were talking off air. I wish we didn't have to have this conversation and that we could talk about many other things, but it is an important conversation. And,
Amen.
And I'm thankful that you're taking the time to be here. So let's start out for today. We just finished up a conversation with Shelly, who is an attorney and also a person of faith. So which of her comments struck you as particularly important given the context?
Well, certainly non-binding. That word is worth repeating over and over and over again. No legal standing.
Definitely a theme.
Yes.
Of the day.
I feel like that's a mantra, a word of spirit for me after listening to that. And I thank you all for your conversation. I also was just thinking about the incredible amount of effort that these politicians are putting forth to demonize, fearmonger, to risk the lives of a very small group of Texans. Not to say that a small group of Texans doesn't matter. They do, absolutely. But I mean, it's just, abominable, unconscionable that this is how they're spending their time, given the amount of needs across Texas with so many different areas. I think you said you were going to be talking about maybe energy, but you've changed the topic. Like, there's a lot of work for our elected public servants to be doing, and this is not it.
Yeah, definitely issues that need to be addressed in the state of Texas. And we spend our time on this. So curious, what surprised you about that conversation? What surprised you most? Maybe what surprised you least?
Well, I wish I could say that I feel any surprise. I don't feel a lot of surprise. I guess one of the things that I do feel is the heartache that, sometimes I think I've built up my walls, right? I'm the mom of a queer kid, and her community includes a lot of trans and non-binary kids. And a lot of these parents are my dearest friends and church goers. And, I guess I am a little surprised by how much it still breaks my heart. You and I were talking beforehand. Part of me just wants to sit here and cry. And so there's that. And at the same time, as we emphasize that these things are non-binding, we also do have to take seriously because, as was said, these are very powerful people who are coming after small, marginalized groups of people. And so I guess that's heavy on my heart today, whether it's particularly surprising or not.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us with kids are feeling similarly. Like, we had to have this conversation with our middle school student over the course of the last few nights, and man, like, it's just challenging. And so I wonder, as a pastor, I wonder if you can say something about why this is especially traumatic, that these kind of messages are coming from state leaders.
Well, our state leaders should be supporting our abilities to live, to survive this time of pandemic. Haven't we been through enough? And to thrive. Certainly for me, my middle schooler went through puberty at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sorry, child, for talking about this, but it's real. And we need, as faith leaders, this is one of the things we've talked about in reproductive dignity work as well, which is we need to talk about the body. We need to talk about what it is to live in a human body. And so I'm going to say, it was really rough for my child and me, parenting somebody going through puberty in isolation, going to school on Zoom. And so haven't we been through enough? And it's devastating to hear from state leaders, that the things we're doing to take care of ourselves, to take care of our kids, our families, are being judged and trying to be litigated. But the other thing that I would say is that the Gay-Straight Alliance is one of the things that got my kid through the pandemic. They had Zoom meetings. And so whether it's your church, as a pastor, whether it's your church explicitly over and over and over again, we cannot say it enough, welcoming, inviting, loving, and caring for our trans kids and their families, our queer kids and their families, whether it's that, or whether it's each of us, particularly parents and pastors who may not have kids who are trans or LGBTQ, but that we make those calls to schools and say, do you have a GSA? Do you have a Gay-Straight Alliance? And I would like to see every single school in Texas having that, because I know that it can be life-saving for our families, especially when our trusted leaders are coming at us this way.
So let's talk more about the role of congregations, because we've talked during this conversation and certainly during Shelly's conversation about the idea that the fact that these are non-binding opinions.
Right.
And I've lost track of how many times we've used the word non-binding during the course of this podcast so far. But clearly, that doesn't mean that faith institutions can ignore our responsibility to respond to the trauma that these state leaders have inflicted. So what do you think about that? What is the role of the faith community in responding?
Absolutely. Well, it's imperative that we as ministers and clergy say to our own congregants and to the wider community, number one, we will absolutely not be reporting any gender-related care that you are giving to your kids or that your kids are seeking. That's not happening. We're not doing that. And I don't care if it were binding. I absolutely, as a person of faith, would not be doing that. And so I think that's also worth saying, right? Like there are some stands for our faith as a Unitarian Universalist. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Every person. And our seventh principle talks about the interconnectedness of all life. So as trans kids and their families are being harmed, it affects the souls of all of us from my faith perspective. And so I just think we cannot say enough that we love and want trans kids and their families in our congregations.
And I think that in about every conversation we've had about this topic, going back to the 2017 bathroom bill, people have talked about the idea that it's especially important for faith communities to speak out on this issue, in part because a lot of these actions are being driven by others in the Texas faith community. And so I feel like, especially today, and given the conversation we've had both on air and off, that it's maybe time for a pastoral moment, right? Like, What would you say to a trans youth today as a Texas faith leader? What would you say to their families? What would you say to the communities who love them?
Well, first of all, I cannot tell you how much the trans loved ones in my life. I play in a band with a trans person. I go to church with trans people. I have mentors who are trans ministers. I cannot tell you how much I love you and how much your very being enriches my life. And that's not what you're here for. You're not here to enrich my life. And nonetheless, that is the truth. That is the fact. Like, to see the ways that trans and non-binary and gender expansive people live their lives to be their fullest selves is to me, that is the ultimate role model for anyone. The Black liberation theologian Howard Thurman is quoted as saying, "Don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do it." Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And that is my favorite. That is my theological touchstone. And I feel like trans people, especially trans kids, are living that. And so I just say to all of you, I love you so much. And you are on my heart and mind constantly. And whatever we can do, I know I can't walk a mile in your shoes or roll a mile in your wheels. But whatever we can do, I hope you will reach out to the clergy that love you and let us be there with you, alongside you. Because it's an honor.
Amen. I've got my sermon for the day. Thank you, Pastor. So, again, the AG's opinion is non-binding. Clergy and other
non-binding.
The
non-binding.
Clergy.
I just can't stop saying it. I want to write like a rock song where the chant is like non-binding.
How about you work on that and then send it over to us, and we can, I'm sure, use it as the theme song for something in the weeks and months to come. My guess is we're not done talking about this after this week. Sadly.
Right.
Clearly, clergy and other mandatory reporters have no responsibility to report. But what recommendations do you have for Texas faith leaders? What do you hope that they be doing rather than following the governor and attorney general's directives?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'd like to see us reaching out to schools, because that's where our kids are spending a lot of their time, and make sure that they have support there in the form of a Gay Straight Alliance or other things, making sure that teachers, educators have training. The Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry is going to be starting a weekly action hour in April. And that's where we can be responsive on a weekly basis to asks of us. And so one of the things that we've done in the monthlies has been to focus on school boards and how we reach out and express our faith values for justice to school boards, because we know that's a very important place. So I would also ask people, progressive and justice-seeking people, to consider running for school board and running for offices. Let's get out there. What else? I mean, for clergy, I hope that we are preaching this from the pulpit. I know that many of us are. You know, we can be sometimes insular, right? Not everybody's on Facebook. Not everybody's, in some of these corners where we're talking to each other. We need to be speaking in the public square and from our pulpits and making sure that our voices are loud and that we claim faith. Like progressives must use our faith voice.
Well, I think especially on this, right? Especially on this where
Absolutely.
where other people of faith are the ones driving discriminatory conversations. And so, yes, all of the things that you said, here, that is our homework for the week. I would add to that, make sure that you're having conversations with your elected representatives as a person of faith to let them know that our faith does not discriminate, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
So, Erin, I really appreciate the conversation. Any shameless plugs or anything you want to leave us with today?
Well, I would say that the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry, while a UU organization, welcomes friends and partners of all faith and no faith. And so by all means, reach out to us and let's be doing this work together. Our website is txuujm.org. You can find us on Facebook as well. I guess I would also like to say to folks, to trans kids, their families, to trans Texans, you belong here. You are loved here. And I hope that you are doing things to take care of yourself and listen to what brings you joy. Don't let these legislators be the boss of you and your spirit, because you know your truth and you are divine. You are divine.
Reverend Erin Walter, what an inspiring word for today. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for the work you're doing to create a better Texas.
Thank you. Right back to you.
I want to thank our guests today, Cantor Sheri Allen, Shelly Skeen, Josh Houston, and Reverend Erin Walter. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. To reiterate what I said at the top, we recognize that this is a hard and frustrating time, but that means that more than ever, Texans of faith are needed to bring voices of sanity to the political discourse. I hope that you'll share this episode with friends who might need to hear it, and spend some time thinking about how you will respond to the events of the day and not just watch it unfold around you while sitting on the couch. Texans of faith are called to take our responsibilities seriously, to care for our neighbors, whether here or across the globe. So let's spend some time this week reaching out to our friends and inviting them on this journey with us. The time to act is now. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And there's a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy. More than ever, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.